And so, as you know, if you've been here for very long, we've been going through the book of Romans for, I think, about 5 months or so now. And I think Joel and Austin decided to give it 2 titles or something because we have both this and the next one. But it sort of plays off of each other because in many ways the book of Romans was referred to or is referenced as being the Roman road, which is one of those common misconceptions that the entire book is about picking a path or road or whatever you want to call it that leads you to salvation through really just plucking verses out of context and just throwing them together, which sadly is the way that many people read the Bible in general. We like to sort of chop it up, put it into small little sections, and then say whatever it says without really understanding the full context of it, the fullness of what's really being said. And I think that's one of the things that's happened with Romans is that it hasn't gotten what the full picture that Paul was trying to display throughout the entire book. And as I started studying it more and more, I realized that really the main points you can find out of chapter 8 about the redemption of creation, that right in the middle of it, it talks about that's the very thing that God's doing. But the way that he's doing it's kind of unexpected, that it's what Romans' book ended with, the obedience of faith of the nations, is that's the way that God is accomplishing it to, as it says earlier in Romans, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, that God is using the people of Israel to bring about the salvation or the redemption of creation of all people. In many ways, that was the plan in the Old Testament, but because Israel chose not to do it, it comes down to what happens in Jesus, that God is still working in that manner, but it's going to happen very differently from what they expected. And we're going to see a bit of that today, but for the most part, what Paul has done so far in the book of Romans in chapters 1 through 7 or so is prove in many different ways that the Jews and the Gentiles come to God in the same way because they all messed up in the same way. And that there's no distinction between them, but they all come to God through faith and through the grace that God has offered to him. And then, again, as we get to chapter 8, he starts to shift a little bit, speaking about the redemption of creation, how all that works. And then in chapters 9 through 11, which they've entitled One Chosen People, he's basically answering the questions of what about Israel? What about the promises made to Israel? What is still left with those? Because, again, what he's explained is a group of people following God who are made up of all the nations, not just the one nation, but all the different nations. So they're left wondering what exactly is happening with them. They had the law, they had the promises, they had all of those things, which Paul points out. So they're wondering what exactly it is that is left for them. How has this actually worked the way that God has set it up? And so really, when we get to this Romans 11, 1 through 10, he's answering the question, who's at fault? The Jews had this idea that God's at fault, whether it's that he hasn't fulfilled his promise yet, which is what Jews still think today because they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, or he just flat out didn't fulfill what he said he was going to do to them. So Paul has to basically, in a way, say that it's not God who is at fault, but it is in fact them who is at fault in response to this. And he's going to do it in kind of an interesting way. He first answers this question, or he first answers the question of whether or not God's at fault, and then he answers the question of who is truly at fault in this. And so, as we see the flow of all of Romans, this comes in that place of he's still trying to answer that question for them of what is happening with those promises made to the people of Israel, what is going on with what God has said he's going to do when it might not fully make sense of what has come out about it. Because again, we know that the Jews had preconceived notions about the fact that the Messiah was going to come and they were going to establish the kingdom of Israel as the kingdom of the world, and they were going to control everything. And when it doesn't happen that way, they're left wondering how the Old Testament passages they know so well are truly fulfilled. And so Paul is in the midst of answering those things, and he ultimately asked this question, therefore I say, God did not push aside his people, did he? May it never possibly come to be. For I myself am also an Israelite, out of a seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God did not push aside his people whom he knew beforehand. Or do you not know in Elijah what the scripture says as he intercedes to God against Israel? And so, again, he asked the question, did God push aside his people? And the answer is very much clearly no. He didn't push aside his people. In fact, the very reality that Paul himself is an Israelite out of the seed of Abraham answers that question, that he did not forget about his people. That just because he is also accepting other people doesn't mean he pushed aside the ones that he foreknew, the ones that he knew beforehand. And then he gives the example of Elijah. But before we go into that, just to give you a little context, Elijah comes on the scene in the Old Testament in the book of 1 Kings, and he just sort of shows up out of nowhere and declares that a drought is going to come across the land. And then God miraculously feeds him and helps him out through that. And then he returns, what is about 3.5 years later, and has a contest between him and the prophets of Baal. And he proves the power of God over the gods that they were worshiping, and then declares that the drought is over and rain comes upon the land. But after that happens, Jezebel, who is the queen, comes after him, trying to kill him, and he runs for his life, and God comes to him and talks to him, and basically Elijah is saying that he's fearing for his life because everything that is for God is being destroyed and taken care of, and that he's the only one that left. But God says that that's not actually true. Instead, he has left 7,000 people for himself who have not turned away from him. That even that though Elijah feels that he is alone, he is not actually as alone as he thinks. And then he's told to go and anoint Elisha and then basically train him up, and eventually he takes over as being the prophet instead of Elijah, while Elijah goes up to God in a chariot of fire. And that's where his story ultimately ends in the Old Testament. But in the middle of that, Paul uses the conversation that Elijah has with God. He says, Lord, your prophets they killed, your altars they tore down, and I myself only was left remaining, and they are now seeking my soul. However, what does the divine response say to him? I set aside to myself 7,000 men, whoever did not bow their knee to Baal. Therefore, thus also now a remnant according to a choice of grace has come to be. So it's not just Paul himself who is making it clear that God has not failed them, but the fact that there is a remnant that still exists. That when God's talking to Elijah, he says this very same thing. I have set aside to myself those 7,000 men. That at the time of Elijah, though it seemed that there were no followers of God, there were still those who were truly following him in the midst of the majority who were not. And so the same thing exists now. Thus now also a remnant exists. But it's a remnant according to a choice of grace that has come to be. Paul, again, he answers the question of whether or not God has forgotten his people here by saying a remnant of them still exists. Though it seems that the majority have rejected, the majority are not part of this kingdom of God that has come, there is still a remnant amongst them that does exist. But he emphasizes that it's by a choice of grace and not by the law. And if by grace, no longer out of works, since grace no longer is coming to be grace. Therefore what? What Israel diligently seeks, this it did not obtain. But the chosen did obtain, and the rest were hardened, just as it has been written. And so he takes this moment to just re-emphasize the thing that he's been pointing out through this, is that it's by grace, not by works of the law. Because if it is by works of the law, then that means that the Gentiles can't just come in freely. It means that they have to go through be circumcised and come to God through the same way that the people of Israel did, through all of those works of the law. But if it is by grace, then it doesn't have to be that way, that all come to God in that manner, not just the Gentiles, but even the Jews themselves. And so if it is a remnant by grace and not out of works, then that makes it very clear that he's just re-emphasizing everything he's been saying throughout this to help them understand that he is working through all of the nations. That's why I like many times translating the word that you can translate as Gentiles or nations as the nations, because it's the nation of Israel and then the rest of the nations is the idea behind it. So even when Paul is saying the obedience of faith of the nations, it's not just the nations, it's also of the nation of Israel, that he's doing all of it. But then he starts to shift here from just talking about how the fact that God didn't fail to what actually happens. And he says what Israel diligently seeks, which is God's favor, entrance into his kingdom, they did not obtain. The chosen ones of them did obtain it, the remnants of them obtained it, but the rest were hardened. And he says, just as it has been written, and says, God gave to them a spirit of stupor, eyes of the things to not see, and ears of the thing to not hear until this very day. So he quotes out of Isaiah, though it's also referenced in Deuteronomy, in very poetic language that kind of becomes confusing to us and we don't really understand it. But I came across a while ago a study about this whole thing that speaks about the fact that when you see stuff like eyes to see but don't see and ears to hear but don't hear, this language is referred to idols 4 or 5 times throughout the Psalms and the prophets in the Old Testament. And then it becomes, in at least a few of those spots, applied to the people who worship them become just like the idols. So they become, so they have eyes but can't actually see the truth. They have ears but can't actually hear it, just like the very idols that they worship. And so that study was to prove the point that people become the very thing they worship, whether the idols that they worship or God being in his image, basically. But the point is that something like this is to say when God gives to them the spirit of stupor, it's not so much God saying, oh, you can no longer have a choice of hearing. They've already made the decision by going off and rejecting him as their God. And so it's like what is said in Romans chapter 1, that God gave them over to go as far as they could with that. They started it, and he allowed them to go their own way with it. And so it's not God forcing people to reject him. It's them already doing it. That's the reason that who's at fault is the fact that the people of Israel had already rejected God. And so when he came through Jesus, trying to bring them back to him, the ones who had already rejected God as a whole, they weren't going to listen to Jesus because they had already rejected the one that Jesus had been sent by. And so I think that this helps us give an answer to that question, that they had become this way, so there was no chance of them entering, but only the remnant, because they hadn't rejected God. And he finishes off it by saying, and David says, let their table come to be into a trap and into a net, and into a cause of stumbling and into a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened of the thing to not see, and bend their back throughout everything. And so again, this just continues that point that they are unable to see or hear or do anything. But if you actually go and read Psalm 69, from which this is quoted, David's just saying this about his enemies. He's calling God to do these things to his enemies. So it's almost as if Paul is using this in a way of saying that Israel, in their rejection of God, had made themselves out to be enemies of God. And so this is the response that they get because of it, that they reject God. And so it becomes, in a sense, a full rejection. So again, Paul is doing everything he can to reemphasize this point that God has not rejected his people in the way that it appears, but instead the people have rejected God, and so it just appears as if he's rejected them because of their false perspective. So to bring this all together, I'm actually taking the next 2 verses here because I think it's sort of one of those places where it's a crossover. It sums up what's happening in this section and leads into where he's going with it afterward. But it gives the people of Israel some hope beyond this fact that it seems like there is no hope for them. It says, "Therefore I say, they did not trip in order that they might fall, did they? May it never possibly come to be. However, by their trespass is salvation to the nations, and to the thing to provoke them to jealousy. If their trespass is riches of the worlds, and their defeat riches of the nations, by how much more their fullness?" So though it seems as if they've lost and everything has happened, Paul's saying that's not what's happened in this situation. That's not what happens. And again, we know that from what I understand, the best part of history tells us that the church was actually primarily Jewish up until maybe around 100 AD or so. That it began with the Jews, again, to be a light to the Gentiles, to bring them in. And so it wasn't as if that remnant was a teeny little bit. It became big for a while and then drifted off. But yet we still know, even to this day, there are still those from the people of Israel who are coming to faith in God. So whatever exactly this may mean of what people want to do to put it into the history, it's the point that there's something greater that is happening here, that though it looks bad, God is still doing something to work out through there, and their acceptance of it is even greater than the acceptance of the rest of the nations because of how hard they rejected in the first place. If that makes any sense to try to understand what that is. So as we close this section up here, to one degree, it can be hard to find good application for all of these different sections because, as I said earlier, it gets so chopped up that we miss the greater picture of what's trying to be portrayed. But I think we can see of what I pointed out, the fact that the number one issue of why people reject God has to do with the idolatry that happens. That the number one reason isn't all these other things that they're making it out to be, but it's the fact that they care about something more than God and they can't get over that. That becomes the biggest part and everything else just follows after that. But there's also this other thing we can learn from here. It's that God's ways over our understanding. That God's ways are always more important. They precede our own understandings. As I said earlier, the Jews had their preconceived notions of what it was going to look like when the Messiah came. And when it didn't happen, they had to reject him. Basically, their preconceived notions were over here and Jesus was over here. They started pretty close together because he looked like he was the Messiah. But the more he spoke, the further they got apart. And there came a point where they can't hold on to either of them anymore. So they have to let go of one or the other. And so the disciples clung to Jesus. It didn't mean that they didn't still hold some of the stuff. They were still trying to go to it. But when push came to shove, when they had to make the decision, they clung to Jesus and held on to him over their own understanding, while many of the Pharisees and others chose to go the opposite direction. That didn't mean that there was no hope for them, because we know some of the Pharisees and other leaders eventually came to Jesus years later. The book of Acts makes mention of that. But there's still that point where we struggle with that in our lives all the time, of whether or not we're going to cling to Jesus and the ways of God, or whether or not we're going to cling to our own preconceived notions of all of this. Because it's not just about wanting things to be our own way, or the pride and the other sins that are so often mentioned that we cling to over God's ways, but there's the fact that we tend to look to all of those different things, the different rules we have to follow, the different ways we have to go about it, that you're supposed to attend church on Sundays, be a decent person, then we add in other stuff depending on what you believe, and that's the way, that's our understanding, but sometimes God's way doesn't always work that way. We know that Jesus said the greatest commandments are to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So if we're not actually using those as the guideline for how we're living, we've already missed it, because sometimes those rules and laws that we think are set in stone, there are what you could call exceptions, or that it depends on the situation or how exactly you deal with something, because sometimes what you do to love God or love another isn't always as perfectly, you can't always define it out perfectly, that the situation depends on how you actually handle things. And sometimes we have to look deeper into what's going on to whether or not we're actually loving our neighbor. Or sometimes we hold to things that we couldn't even describe how that's actually loving to our neighbor or not loving to our neighbor. And maybe we need to look deeper into what it is. But it also comes down to the fact that God's way is the way of grace, but we have a tendency to forget that. We go back and try to uphold the same things that they did of the laws and the rules, as I was saying, and we don't allow God to actually work in people. That sometimes the problem isn't that they've rejected God, but they've rejected the way we said something or the way that we've gone about doing things or whatever. Or they just need to take the long route to actually get to God, but we push them off before they have a chance to get there, and there's no hope for them. We have to recognize that God's timing and our timing is not the same, that us wanting a person to be perfect right away is just probably never going to happen, because that just isn't the way that God works. That sometimes our understanding of what we think it means like to evangelize and disciple people isn't actually God's way of doing things. And so we have to always be bringing ourselves back to God, always be looking and noticing what he's doing and clinging to that over our own understandings. And I don't say all this to say that our understandings are wrong or we need to rethink everything, but I'm saying this is that we need to start taking a closer look at these things, and we need to actually examine everything that we think is true to see if that's truly a part of God's way, or if it's just our own understanding that we're trying to make be a part of God's way. And so that's what I think this teaches us, is just as Paul answers the question of who's at fault, it's not that God's at fault, it's that the people have rejected God and what he actually gave to them. And so their understanding was wrong about it, just like our understandings can be wrong. So the question becomes, when our arms get stretched all the way out, are we going to cling to Jesus, or are we going to cling to our own understandings?